Good morning and welcome to the second session of the 2024 League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, Jane Kirschenheiter Zimmerman Issues Briefing. I'm Deborah Cronmiller. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. This year, we are pleased to be renaming our issues briefing to the Jane Kirschenheiter Zimmerman Issues Briefing. Earlier this year, Steve Zimmerman and his wife Sharon established a fund to honor Steve's mom and provide a long-term support for the League's issues briefing. Jane was a member of the Dane County League, formerly the Madison League, from 1968 to 1973. She was a stay-at-home mother like so many women of her generation and found intellectual stimulation, companionship with like-minded women, and an outlet for advocacy in her League work. Jane cared about the issues the League studied and the positions we adopted. To honor her memory, the Jane Kirschenheiter Zimmerman Fund will forevermore ensure that the League can continue to explore topics important to League members through expert testimony and discussion at our annual issues briefing. Today, we are going to continue our theme of justice for all in Wisconsin in this, the second episode of our issues briefing. This morning, we'll focus specifically on justice matters in our judicial system. We'll be featuring two guests this morning, both from the Redistricting Data Hub. Unfortunately, the Honorable Judge Everett Mitchell, a Dane County Circuit Court judge, is ill today and will be unable to present. We will, of course, invite him back for a future session so he can provide an overview of the juvenile division of our court system, as well as our high-risk court drug program. In the judge's absence, we're going to take this morning's opportunity to update you all on some of the work of our Judicial Integrity and Nonpartisan Redistricting Committee, work that they're doing to ensure a more just court system in Wisconsin, and how we intend to create a long-term solution to Wisconsin's partisan map drawing process. With that, let's begin with our experts from the Redistricting Data Hub. Kate Donovan, Director, and Peter Horton, Senior Data Analyst, will provide us with much needed information from their recently published report on Wisconsin's prison gerrymander and the impact that prison gerrymandering is having in Wisconsin. Kate and Peter work for the Redistricting Data Hub, a nonpartisan organization committed to ending all forms of gerrymandering. Please feel free to put your questions to Kate or to Peter in the chat as we go along. We'll have them answer those questions right after they speak and before we move ahead with learning more about what we're doing here in Wisconsin as a league. With that, Kate, let's kick it off. Please feel free to provide us a little bit more information about you and the Redistricting Data Hub.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you all for showing up on a Saturday morning here to talk about what obviously we think is an important issue, prison gerrymandering in particular, but gerrymandering in all forms. We spend our weekdays thinking about and trying to support a variety of organizations, including organizations like League of Women Voters, to stamp it out in their state legislative and congressional districts. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. There we go. And as Deborah noted, yeah, feel free to put some questions in the chat. While I'm presenting, it's a little bit difficult for me to keep an eye on it, but Peter knows a tremendous amount about this issue. And so, can chime in and respond to anything in the chat. And if there's anything that he's not able to address for any reason, we'll get to it at the end. So as Deborah mentioned, I'm Kate Donovan. I'm the director of the Nonpartisan Redistricting Data Hub, or RDH, as we like to call it. And as I've already alluded to, I'm joined today by my tremendous colleague, Peter Horton, who's a senior data analyst at the RDH. He's worked extensively with data related to prison gerrymandering and performed the analyses that we'll be walking through later on in this presentation. So my agenda today is to first briefly introduce our organization and what we do, which will help explain why we're here to talk about this today. Then I'll jump right into the issue of prison gerrymandering itself. Some of you may already be familiar or know a little bit about it, but I definitely don't want to presume and instead make sure that we are all on the same page about how it actually works and what the impacts are across a variety of issues, in fact. As part of this, I'll explain what the solutions are and make a quick pitch as well for what League of Women Voters or other organizations can do in partnership with us to tackle this issue even better, especially in light of the less gerrymandered legislative maps that were recently enacted in Wisconsin. And then once we're oriented, I'll talk about the current landscape nationally, and finally focus on the possible effects of prison gerrymandering in Wisconsin, specifically utilizing that report that Deborah mentioned and which is available on our website. Oops. So let's jump right in. The Redistricting Data Hub was formed in 2019 to meet a key need that was identified as really missing in the 2011 cycle. That being a trusted central place for all the many, many data sets that are needed for nonpartisan redistricting. Redistricting is a very data intensive and technical process. So we host a lot of data in all 50 states. Many of these data sets you'd think are readily accessible from the states themselves, but if they are, they're often not in a usable format, or they require extensive collection from every county across the state, or cost exorbitant sums to access, among many other issues. I have a lot more to say about that, but we'll save that for another time. Our mission is to provide all the data along with the accompanying tools and knowledge necessary to fight gerrymandering of all kinds and participate effectively in state legislative, congressional, and to some extent local redistricting. Local redistricting is a very big problem just because there are so many localities and we work nationally. So we do our best to support folks that are working on local redistricting, but there are some limits to how much we can do there. RDH data has been used by expert witnesses in litigation in more than a dozen states, as well as what are called special masters. These are court-appointed map drawers. So this actually includes the special masters in Wisconsin who were appointed by the court after the legislative districts were struck down as unconstitutional. Eventually, the state legislature ended up passing the governor's map and ending the process there. So the maps that the special masters were working on ultimately were not utilized, but they were planning on submitting maps that would eventually get drawn. And special masters do get used in other states, New York and Virginia, as just some quick examples where maps are in place that were drawn by court-appointed specialists. The data is also used extensively by community organizers and advocates, journalists at various national and local outlets, academics working on research related to redistricting, and lots of research unrelated to redistricting, and thousands of members of the public who want to get more engaged with the process. Peter and I joined the organization back in September 2020 for what we thought was a term-limited gig through the end of the 2021 cycle. But it turns out this cycle has a very long tail, so long, in fact, that we are already starting to plan for the 2031 cycle. So heading into 2025, our mission is the same, but with a special focus on states with mid-decade redraws, ongoing litigation, and reform movements. That means a lot of our day is focused on collecting and processing critical up-to-date data sets, such as precinct-level election results joined with geospatial data for mapping, voter file and turnout data, census data, including data on the population by race and ethnicity, education, income, language, and more, candidate race and ethnicity data, official maps, and lots more beyond that. We also provide custom data sets and analysis for stakeholders on request, as well as providing support to the public by answering questions through our help desk or trainings like these. And we work with Dave's Redistricting app, a free mapping tool that utilizes our data and makes drawing and analyzing maps accessible to all. So at RDH, we care about and want to eliminate gerrymandering in all its forms. And just to be, again, very clear here, when we're talking about gerrymandering, we're talking about when district lines are drawn to give one group or even one individual a disproportionate advantage to winning and retaining that seat relative to others. You are probably familiar with partisan or racial gerrymandering, since that does get a lot more attention in the media. Racial gerrymandering actually violates, there's a couple different kinds of racial gerrymandering. So one kind of racial gerrymandering violates the US Constitution. Another form of it violates the Federal Voting Rights Act. And in some places, it can also violate state laws. It is the only form of gerrymandering that is prohibited everywhere. In contrast, partisan gerrymandering is only in violation of state constitutions or state laws, since the US Supreme Court declared it to be non-justiciable and Congress has not passed any laws prohibiting the practice. There's also incumbent gerrymandering, whereby specific individuals already in power are given unfair advantage. It's actually required in some states. Some states require incumbent gerrymandering. One of the many shocking things I've learned in my time here. But in others, it is in fact outlawed. Wisconsin, for the record, has neither a requirement nor a prohibition on incumbent gerrymandering. And then there is prison gerrymandering, what we're here to talk about today, which, like partisan and incumbent gerrymandering, is prohibited on a state-by-state basis. I'll show you in a bit which states, but I'll let you know now that probably is not a surprise that Wisconsin is not one of those currently prohibiting prison gerrymandering. So really, the fundamental argument against prison gerrymandering is rooted in the US Constitution and this concept of one person, one vote. To understand this concept, it's useful to look at how it is already applied to redistricting. So prior to the 1960s, a lot of districts were malapportioned. Malapportioned basically means that districts within a specific legislative body have unequal numbers of people in them. So if you have twice as many people in one district than another, but they both have just one representative and one vote in that legislative body, then basically the people in the less populated district have twice as much voting power as people in the more populated district. So in 1964, the Supreme Court ended up ruling on a series of redistricting cases, including one that affected congressional districts, that was Westbury versus v. Sanders, and then another immediately after affecting state legislative and local districts, Reynolds v. Sims. They found that the Constitution requires to be equal-ish in population. The map at issue in the congressional case was Georgia's map, which had districts 2 and 3 times larger than others. The map at issue in the second case concerned the Alabama Senate. Now, state senates in most, if not all states, used to be modeled after the US Senate. So each county would get one senator, regardless of their population. This meant that state senates were especially malapportioned. In Alabama at the time, some districts were 10 to 20 times as large as others. If Wisconsin still did this today, for example, Milwaukee County, using 2020 census data, with 940,000 people in it, and I hope I'm pronouncing all of your Wisconsin areas correctly, Menominee, with less than 5,000, would both have the same level of representation in the state Senate, one vote each. So that's a ratio of 188 to 1. In Reynolds, the majority wrote, "Legislators represent people, not trees or acres. Legislators are elected by voters, not farms or cities or economic interests." So this is where our notion of one person, one vote comes from. To make sure that districts have equal population-ish, and for other reasons, legislative bodies must redistrict at least once a decade. Now, I keep saying ish in regards to the equal population requirement, and that's because districts don't have to be perfectly equal, This is mathematically impossible in some cases. So the rule is that for congressional districts, the population should be within one person, not percent. That's what I first heard when I learned about it. Literally one person. State legislative districts, for a few reasons, have more flexibility. Typically, the overall range of the population must be within 10%. So there I am saying percent, not person. Well, what is the range? To use a simplified example here, imagine 1,000 people in a state and 10 districts. So perfectly equal population would be 100 people in each district. However, because there are other rules that redistricting maps must meet, map drawers have good reasons to deviate from this so-called ideal population of 100 people per district. Let's say that in the end, among all the districts in this imaginary state, the smallest had 95 and the largest had 105. If we express this as a percentage deviation from that ideal of 100, we would take, for example, 95 minus 100, that's 5, divided by 100, that's minus 5%. Same thing for that larger district, 105 minus 100 divided by 100, that's 5%. You sum up the largest and the smallest population deviation, and you get the overall range, which in this case happens to be exactly 10%. This 10% limit on the overall range is not a bright line rule. You can have population deviations that are more unequal than this if the map drawers can demonstrate there was a compelling and competing interest to do so, such as compliance with the Voting Rights Act, minimizing county splits, and so on. And to make my hypothetical example a bit more concrete, let's take a look at the actual population deviations in the wake of the 2021 redistricting cycle to see how much states comply with this. I should have checked on this too in our pre-think. You can see this, right? The window that just popped open. Okay, great. And I believe Peter is going to pop it in the chat as well so that you can take a look. So this is from the National Conference of State Legislatures. They're a great nonpartisan resource for a variety of election-related information, including redistricting. And so what they've got here, this is from the 2021 redistricting cycle. They've got the congressional districts and their population deviations in these first 3 columns. And then you've got each state Senate and state House in the next 4 columns. And so if you just focus on this column here, the absolute range first among congressional, you can see that in a lot of cases, it is actually 1 person, 2 people. There are a couple of exceptions to this. Hawaii, a lot of islands, very challenging to draw equal districts there and also comply with their other rules. You know, Iowa gets a little bit higher, but you know, it's really, really close in a lot of cases. Wisconsin, deviation of 2 people. If I scroll back up and focus on the Senate and the House, here they're giving you that percentage range. And so again, you'll see that in almost all cases, states do keep their population deviations under that 10% limit. Hawaii, again, sort of stands out, you know, 43%. It's just very challenging there to draw decent districts and to keep the population super close to equal. But South Dakota goes a little bit above it, but Wyoming a little bit above it, but pretty much everybody else is below that 10% threshold. Here's Wisconsin, very low population deviations, 0.57% in the House, I think it was, that was on the left, and 0.76. Oh, sorry, it was, the Senate's on the left, 0.57 in the Senate and 0.76 in the House. So what data do states use to figure out if districts are within this correct population range? Well, they use the decennial census data, last done in 2020, to be done again in 2030. That is true, even if they're drawing maps mid-decade, they'll still go back and use that 2020 census data. According to the Census Bureau, the goal of the census is to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. For a lot of reasons, that doesn't actually happen, but they try their very best and they come up with decent numbers to draw districts that are containing equal population. I'm going to drop the ish now that you all understand what I mean when I actually say equal population. You can mentally add it back in if you'd like. A couple of things to note here. The Bureau wants to count everyone, citizens and non-citizens. That's because the Constitution refers repeatedly to people. However, the question of whether non-citizens can be included for congressional reapportionment and state redistricting is almost certainly going to be a fight in the lead up to the 2030 census. The Bureau also wants to avoid undercounting and overcounting. There are populations that are historically undercounted for a variety of reasons. Native populations being one of them, children under 4 as well. On the flip side, whites tend to be overcounted in the census. And the Bureau wants to count people in the right place. Well, what does that mean? In the right place is typically interpreted by the Census Bureau as usual residence. The usual residence of a person is easy to determine if you live in the same place for 10 years, which is how long the maps that are drawn based on that census data are ultimately in effect. But there are lots of housing situations that do not fit that easy mold. So think college students, for example, who are typically counted at the schools where they are attending if the census is happening while they are in school. Overseas members of the military who are counted at the base where they are stationed. And then incarcerated individuals, which are currently counted by the Census Bureau at the facilities in which they are confined. So this excellent graphic is from the Prison Policy Initiative. We've partnered with them on several reports, and they do a lot of great work on this issue and other topics related to incarceration. Again, if you're looking for an excellent nonpartisan resource to learn more about prison gerrymandering or other, as I said, issues related to incarceration, I would highly recommend them. So this number of how many people are in prisons, jails, and other types of detention centers literally changes daily. But at last count, there's a little under 2 million people. This may be difficult to see, but since they do break it down by type of offense here, that's what's going on around the outside of the wheel. But you can see that a little bit more than half are in state prisons, about a quarter are in jails. I don't know, I'm bad at quick math here, but some percentage is in federal prisons and jails. And then this section right here is what they've broken out over on the right-hand side so that you can see, youth under 18 who are in various facilities, territorial prisons, that's the green there, immigration detention centers, that's the gray, involuntary commitment, right? People with mental issues, for example. And then you've also got Indian country and military down here. So now this whole prison pie here includes people who are serving life sentences. And so it is reasonable to say that they will actually be at that facility for 10 years and more. But it also includes lots of people serving sentences less than 10 years, which may be up to half of the incarcerated population. This also includes a lot of people in jails awaiting trial. So they haven't even been sentenced yet. And and they may not be sentenced at all, right? They may actually be found not guilty. Or if they are found guilty and sentenced, they may be sentenced to something other than incarceration. Or of course, a fairly short sentence. So what does this mean for redistricting? It means that to the extent that people are counted at the facilities where they are incarcerated, instead of in the communities where they usually reside, the population of districts gets distorted. So again, let me walk you through a simplified example just to see exactly how this works. These images come from our website. We'll put a plug for that at the end of this so that you can check out the full article there as well as other resources that we have online. So imagine a state with 2 congressional districts, let's say Montana. And to keep the math super easy, we're going to say that there's only 200 individuals that live in this state. There's 100 that live in District A over on the left-hand side there, and 100 that are over in District B. To make a very closely related point at the end of all this, let's also imagine that in our state, everyone votes in elections. So let's say that 10 of the individuals in District A are convicted and sentenced to a prison located in District B. So these 10 people highlighted in orange usually reside in District A, but they've been incarcerated in District B. And when the census rolls around, these individuals are going to be counted as residing in District B. That means that the districts are now malapportioned. There are only 90 people in District A, 110 in District B. Congressional districts need to be within one person, so this is not acceptable. The state is going to have to redraw the lines, or line really, since there's only 2 districts here, to increase the population of A by 10 people, or 9 or 11, and decrease the population of B by 10 people. If the prison is smack in the middle of District B, or really anywhere that's not along the border between these 2 districts, it's going to make a lot more sense to draw about 10 other people, not the incarcerated people, in District A, in District B, and move them back over to District A. So those are the folks that are highlighted in green here. They're about to be redistricted. So the state redistricts. Now we've got those 10 green individuals back in District A, and we have again achieved population equality. But remember, I said everyone votes in this imaginary state. Well, also imagine that this state, like 48 actual states, prohibits you from voting while incarcerated for a felony. And also imagine that this state, like most states, don't make much of an effort to provide an opportunity to vote for those who committed misdemeanors or are awaiting trials. As an aside, I'm still simplifying here, since although prisons are typically run by the state, jails are typically operated by counties or municipalities. This means that District B, not helpful when I confuse the letters here. This means that District B now contains 100 individuals, 10 of which came from District A, and they cannot vote in elections, including congressional elections. So they have 100 people, same as District A, but only 90 who can vote. And as a result, the votes of the non-incarcerated individuals in District B are no longer equal to the votes of individuals in District A. The votes of these non-incarcerated people in the District B are in effect worth more. So one factor I haven't emphasized yet is how far away the facility is from the incarcerated individual's home. In thinking about congressional districts, even if you are incarcerated far from home, you may still be counted as residing in the same district. But certainly as you go down in district size to state house and state senate districts, and certainly local districts like county commissions, city councils, you don't have to be very far away at all to be counted in another district. New York and Maryland were the first states to address this issue in the 2011 cycle. There was a report by Demos looking at it was actually looking at the 2001 cycle in these states to see how prison gerrymandering had distorted the populations and the district makeup in these 2 states, and then how New York and Maryland ultimately took on these reforms in the 2011 cycle. Again, that's something that will pop in the chat if it's not there already. It's a really great read to see sort of how some of these first states started tackling this issue. So in this report from Demos, it's a bit dated at this stage, but again, they were looking at the 2001 redistricting cycle there. And in New York, for example, they found that 66%, 2/3 of New York State's prisoners were from New York City, but 91% were incarcerated upstate. A map I'm going to show you in just a second, which comes from the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and uses more recent data from the 2020 census, focusing on Florida, of course, visually shows just how far away folks can be incarcerated from their homes. So this map is a little tricky to analyze. So I'm gonna click on it here and actually, oh no, I went into the ocean. Let's center on here. So you can kind of zoom in and out. And basically what's happening here is you've got the congressional districts broken down in Florida, and then showing the gains and the losses from district to district. So there's a lot of lines going on here, which is sort of what makes it a little bit difficult to interpret. But each line is sort of shaded from pink, which is the home district of that incarcerated person. And then it gradiates over to green, which is where the person is confined, right? The prison district. And so you can just kind of scroll around and see, right, you know, how many people get sent around. You know, there's people from the Panhandle that get sent all the way down to, you know, Miami, you know, or over to Central Florida, right? So it ends up, you know, because we incarcerate a lot of folks, ends up being a pretty big impact, and, you know, in a lot of cases impacting nearly every district. So in sum, that's how prison gerrymandering works. You incarcerate people, sometimes far from their homes. You count them in the census as residing at the prison or jail. You use that data to draw districts that will be in effect for the next 10 years. And in the vast majority of cases, you prohibit them or certainly fail to facilitate voting while incarcerated. So what is the solution? Spoiler alert, it involves data. In nearly all states that have addressed this issue, what they do is they obtain data from the state's Department of Corrections on the incarcerated population. These states collect data on the incarcerated individual's home address, or what we and others call last known address. And in some cases, they will also collect demographic data, such as the race and ethnicity of the incarcerated individuals. There is a lot of cleanup involved with these last known addresses. And then once they are cleaned, you have to find a way to link it back to the census data. So the smallest unit of geography for which census data is available is called the census block. Census blocks vary in size and population, but imagine a city block in an urban area with, you know, a couple hundred people in it. Census blocks in rural areas are going to be geographically larger, but, you know, contain roughly the same population. To link individual addresses to census blocks, you have to do a process called geocoding. The Census Bureau and other sites have a geocoder. So if you all want to do this, you can enter your personal address, and you get back a latitude and longitude coordinate that can now be plotted on a map. And then you overlay that with census blocks to figure out what census block that person should be counted as residing at. Now you can reallocate some incarcerated individuals from the facilities to their last known address and create what we call an adjusted census data set. So like my hedge around equal population, note that I said some individuals can be reallocated. Not all incarcerated people can be, or even should be, according to the rules in a state, reallocated back to their last known address. The percent of all incarcerated individuals who are ultimately reallocated depends on a number of factors. This includes data quality. So some addresses are just not recorded correctly, or they're missing information. It also depends on the address itself. If the person lives out of state or they're homeless, for example, there is no address. I like to give an example from Nevada whenever I'm talking about this. We were in a conversation with the folks who did the reallocation in that state, and they mentioned that a non-trivial number of incarcerated people in their state are actually from California. And so because we're doing this on a state-by-state basis, there's really nothing to be done about those folks. It also depends on the type of detention center. Some state laws, for example, indicate that federal prisoners should be reallocated, but no federal detention center or prison has complied to date. I believe that most, if not all states, end up focusing on state prison populations as well, because as I mentioned earlier, the jails are run by counties and municipalities. So that ends up being a much bigger data problem once you start having to go down to the local level, and jails have much higher turnover than prisons as well. So that's a challenge. And there's also sentence length. So states with prison gerrymandering reforms vary in terms of whether all incarcerated individuals end up, or at least they try to reallocate all incarcerated individuals, or only some with shorter sentence lengths. So Pennsylvania, for example, ultimately decided to reallocate people with sentences of less than 10 years. So this probably sounds like a lot of work being done state by state, and that's because it is. You have to do this geocoding process to get from addresses to census blocks. The federal facilities won't comply. People who are from out of state can't be reallocated back. So one alternative solution that a lot of groups have been working on, including the Prison Policy Initiative, is to change how the Census Bureau counts incarcerated people in the first place. However, to date, comments from the director of the Census Bureau do not indicate that they are likely to do this for 2030, but of course, one never knows. All right, so now I get to the analysis portion of the presentation. And so I'll be showing a series of images and tables from, as I mentioned earlier, a national report that looks at states with reforms in the 2021 cycle. And then we'll look at a report on Wisconsin specifically. So in the 2021 redistricting cycle, there were 13 states who had enacted this specific form of prison gerrymandering reform. I know, for example, Massachusetts doesn't do this type of reallocation, but they do require that sort of the prisons be taken into account when they are redistricting. But they're kind of an outlier in this regard. Pretty much everybody else does this reallocation method. And so what you see here is in purple, states that reallocated incarcerated people for state legislative and congressional districts. The gold is state legislative only. And then we've also been adding the states that have added reforms post 2021. So we anticipate that in the 2031 cycle, there will be 16 states that will ultimately enact reforms. Minnesota recently passed this as part of their State Voting Rights Act. Illinois adopted it shortly after the 2021 redistricting cycle, as did Maine. Here's a breakout of the 13 states who adjusted the census data for redistricting in 2021 with details about the variation in policies they enacted. So as you can see, states had different approaches to how they handled federal prisoners. So that's this second column here, where some cases they basically just removed. So they subtracted those folks from the data set entirely. But they had no address data to reallocate them back. So they were just taken out. So if you actually look at the adjusted census data versus the 2020 census data, you'll get smaller numbers. Other states, like Colorado, decided to ultimately just keep them in place. So they're still counted in the data, but they're counted at the facility. And then there's a couple places where it's not really clear what they did. You can also see that the same is true in terms of that variation for individuals with out-of-state addresses and incomplete address data. Those are the next two columns here, where in some cases they were removed, other cases kept in place, and in still other cases, not clear what they did with those folks. Rhode Island, I will call out, was especially opaque about their process. The next column highlights that two states, Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, do not have prison gerrymandering reform enshrined in their state laws. So, I said that we anticipate 16 states will do prison gerrymandering reform in 2031, but these two states are not on the books, so to speak. So it is possible that they will decide not to do it in 2031, but one might expect that they would. In the next column, you can see that some states also provided data with updated race and ethnicity counts, because here's the thing. People in prisons and jails are not a representative sample of the population as a whole. They tend to be male, young, people of color. Age and gender don't come up too much in redistricting, but race and ethnicity definitely does. And so having that data can be really helpful too. To again give you an example from that Demos report, in New York, they found that the state's prison population was 77% African American or Latino, and 98% of the state's prisoners were in disproportionately white districts. The final columns are really about the data transparency. So calling out Rhode Island again for failing to release an adjusted data set at all at the block level. And Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Virginia for not providing any supporting documentation about their methodology. We are data people after all, so we appreciate those small details. Here's a breakdown of the degree to which each state successfully reallocated their incarcerated population. Because of variation in states' choices about who to reallocate, for example, based on sentence length, it's important to remember that not every state was aiming for 100% reallocation. Nonetheless, this is the metric that often gets used when talking about prison gerrymandering reform. The first column is the number of adults at facilities according to the Census Bureau. And the second is the number of people who were ultimately not counted at that facility, either because they were reallocated or because they were removed from the data set. The number of people removed is in fact, the last column of this table. The third column here, the percent no longer counted at the facility, is basically the second column divided by the first. So as the header implies, what percent were not counted at the facility. And as you can see, it ranges from a low of 33% in Pennsylvania to a high of 94% in Connecticut. The fourth column gives the breakdown of how many were ultimately reallocated, and the fifth column, which I want to draw your attention to, and so it's in that purple box there, is the percent counted at their last known address. And as I said, this is the metric that a lot of people end up focusing on. Again, a lot of variation here. It ranges from a low of 23% in Montana to a high of 78% in Delaware, with an average of 55% ultimately being reallocated back. Now, if you have the census data and you have the adjusted census data, it's easy to figure out what the impact of prison gerrymandering in a state is. You can compare the population counts between the two, and you know exactly how many people each district gained or lost. But what about a state that doesn't have reform and doesn't have the data, like Wisconsin? So in a small number of states, we at RDH have been able to partner with groups to get this last known address data. So we did this in Rhode Island, and we also did this in Louisiana, where we partnered with a group called Vote to do a really precise analysis of exactly how prison gerrymandering impacts their districts. We're hoping to do that in a couple other states. As you saw earlier, Florida actually has data available, so we might be doing something there. But we've also talked to groups in states where they just get stonewalled. For example, a group in Alabama was really interested in working on this issue, and they just were told that basically the data doesn't exist. So this is my pitch to you all, that if you all would be interested, or other organizations in Wisconsin would be interested in getting a really precise analysis of exactly how prison gerrymandering is impacting the districts that you have in Wisconsin, being willing to try to obtain that address data, that last known address data from the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, is basically the step that we ask other groups to do. And then we take everything from there, do the analysis, create the report. And as I said, it ends up being a lot more precise than what we have in other states currently, and what I'll be walking through for Wisconsin currently. So in those states where we don't have that data, which is a lot, we utilize data sets put together by 3 researchers at Villanova University. That's Rory Kramer, Brianna Remster, and Denise Wilson. What they did was a lot of work, so they deserve credit here. Basically, they tracked down the best proxy data available, right? The best sort of substitute data available in all but 6 states. In Wisconsin's case, they were able to obtain sentencing data at the county level, and that's what we used in our report, and what I'll show you the highlights from in just a second. But before we dig into the findings, there are some key differences between this sentencing data that they obtained and a block level adjusted data set like what you see in states with actual reforms, or in those states I just mentioned, like Louisiana. So number one, it's unclear how closely correlated sentencing data is to last known address data. We spoke with Rory and Brianna about this, and they know a lot more about it than we do. So according to them, there is some research showing that they tend to be correlated. And this is also, I do have a small background in criminal justice, supported by one of the more popular theories of crime, where for the most part, people commit crimes based on opportunity. And so that means usually something close to home, right? Like people don't tend to like drive far away to do crime. There is some evidence that where people would be sort of ultimately convicted and sentenced and where they actually live are going to be pretty similar. But we do also have that example I mentioned from Nevada, where at least in some instances, there are people who drive far away and end up doing things that land them in jails and prisons. So again, sort of like unclear how much of a mismatch there is there between those two things. Number two, this data is at the county level. So to do the analysis, what Peter had to do basically is disaggregate the data from the county down to census blocks and then back up to the districts. That means that particularly in urban areas where there are typically multiple districts within a county, the data is a little messy. And again, it's sort of unknown to what degree. Finally, they were not able to obtain sentencing data for all incarcerated individuals in a state. Now, at least in this case, we can quantify the degree to which their data are missing individuals because we have counts of the incarcerated population from the Census Bureau that we can compare with. And that's what you see here. On the left-hand side is a plot of the incarcerated population based on the 2020 census data, with the size of the circles proportional to how many people are incarcerated there. And on the right-hand side is a plot of what we refer to as the counterfactual data set that comes from the Villanova team. As you can see, the data has a lot, but not all incarcerated people. So roughly 60% of the total, to be precise. And in particular, just at a quick glance and sort of a guess here, probably, they got the really big prisons, right? Just based on the size of the circles that you see appearing in both plots there. And a lot of the smaller facilities are the ones that are missing here. So what does it look like if we put all these folks back in the counties where they were sentenced, disaggregate it down to census blocks, and then back up to your current districts? So here you see in order from left to right, the congressional, state senate, and state assembly maps in order. No district numbers because it gets really messy on a map. So the good news is that if you download the report, we have tables with all the districts listed out with those district numbers and then the specific data for those districts so that you can go and look up, whatever district you live in or whatever district of his interest to you to figure out what's going on here. And so on these maps, the darker purple colors indicate population loss and darker orange colors indicate population gain. If Wisconsin were to enact prison gerrymandering reform, we estimate that Congressional District 6, which is represented by Glenn Grothman, would lose more than 8,000 people. District 4, represented by Gwen Moore, would gain over 6,000 people. 3 other congressional districts would change in population by about 1,000 to 1,500 people. So actually, it turns out that in your all's case, the congressional districts are impacted quite a bit. In the state senate, we estimate that District 13, that's the dark purple one right here, who's represented by John Jagler, would lose nearly 3,800 people. District 4, which looked to be currently vacant, at least as of last week, District 6, represented by LaTanya Jackson, would each gain about 2,000 people. Those are these districts down here in the bottom right-hand corner of the state. The standout in the assembly is District 37, District 37, that's right here, represented by William Penterman, which we estimate would lose more than 4,000 people if the state were to enact prison gerrymandering reform. The gain in population across assembly districts is a bit more diffuse, so there aren't really any standouts in this regard. But again, you can look up specific districts in the report. If prison gerrymandering were taken into account, it is clear that the population deviations of Wisconsin's congressional districts would not be acceptable. After all, they are supposed to be within one person, not 8,000. The overall range of the Senate and Assembly maps both increase when prison gerrymandering is taken into account. And in the case of the Assembly, it jumps up quite a bit. But ultimately, they both do remain below that 10% threshold based on this data. Sorry, keep doing it. Now, we mostly focus on state legislative and congressional redistricting, but as I mentioned, the problem is likely to become more acute as you go down in district size. Counties and cities and many other entities also have districts that can be impacted by prison gerrymandering. So the Prison Policy Initiative actually keeps track of what localities do have prison gerrymandering reforms in each state. According to them, you all do have a small number here. So Crawford County, and then again, forgive me if my pronunciation's a little off here, but New Lisbon, Portage, Prairie du Chien, and Stanley. But of course, that's a very small sample of all the counties and municipalities in Wisconsin, so the vast majority do not have reforms. Peter very handily pulled out some quick examples here just to highlight the problem at the local level. Again, it's a big problem for us to take on working in all 50 states, so we do what we can, but don't dip down too often, too much into local redistricting. And some interesting examples that he found was, in Chippewa County, where the ideal population is 3,157 based on the 2020 data. 2 of their 21 county supervisor districts have roughly 750 incarcerated adults counted as residing in each of them. So that's like almost a quarter of each district's population. In Jackson County, and this is actually coming from a little mini fact sheet from the Prison Policy Initiative, they had an interesting example from 2010. I took a quick look to see if I could figure out what the new numbers were or what they did in 2020 was. Didn't find anything, but if anybody knows, feel free to jump in here. But in Jackson County, the ideal population at the time was 1,076. That's actually gone down a little bit in the 2020 census. And they had nearly 1,000 people at the Jackson Correctional Institute. So if they had basically ignored the facility and tried to draw equal population districts, they would have ended up with a district that was just basically the facility, right? So rather than doing that, they ended up splitting the facility into 4 different districts. But because the population of the county is so small, that still ends up having a pretty big impact on those 4 districts. And in fact, District 12 ended up being still pretty heavily impacted because basically about 50% of their population was still in the facility. So jumping back to our report on statewide districts, and I've only got a few more slides here. I'm grateful that I got extra time because I did not realize how long I was going to go. But we're near the end here. Jumping back to our report, it's interesting to note that the congressional and state Senate district that would gain the most population are both represented by Black women. And the congressional, state Senate, and state assembly seats that would lose the greatest population are all represented by white men. And indeed, given that the incarcerated population is demographically different from the population as a whole, it would not be surprising at all to see that the racial makeup of districts is also affected by prison gerrymandering. For demonstrative purposes, I'm only showing the congressional districts here, but the state Senate and the state House districts are available in the report with all of this. And you can just see here again, just the white population on the left and the Black population on the right, where again, population loss is in dark purple, population gain in darker orange, if prison gerrymandering reform were to be implemented in the state. So District 6, which is that dark purple district in both, would lose both white and Black population. District 4 would largely gain back Black population, and districts 5 and 8 would gain most of the white population. So prison gerrymandering not only has consequences for the equality of districts, but also potentially significant impacts on the racial makeup of districts and thus enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. In addition to the discrepancies based on who is in the district, there is also the related question of who gets to vote. So if folks in prisons and jails are demographically different from the community surrounding a facility, then it stands to reason they might also hold different policy positions and vote differently too. But of course, in many cases, they are disenfranchised. So again, to see how this works in Wisconsin, Peter pulled out again a couple examples here where, you know, the outcome of the election was close enough that it's, you know, easy to reason that the prison has an impact by virtue of being in that district, and then again, not allowing folks to vote. So looking at the 2024 state legislative elections, for example, there's a state assembly race and a state senate race where this, you know, could plausibly be true. In state senate district 14, there's a little over 1,000 incarcerated adults. In the general election, the Democratic candidate edged out the Republican by about 2,300 votes. So this is, again, close enough that you can imagine if the population of the district was altered based on prison gerrymandering reform and incarcerated individuals were allowed to vote, the outcome could have easily been different. An even better example comes from the State Assembly District 88, where there are a little over 1,000 incarcerated individuals once again. In the general election, the Republican candidate edged out the Democrat by 221 votes. Now, notice this is coming from Wisconsin Public Radio, so these totals could be slightly different in the official certified results. It is very easy to imagine in this scenario how the election could have gone differently, even without reallocating individuals back to their last known address. Just to drive home the point here of how the demographics of incarcerated people can differ from the surrounding community, here's a racial dot plot of District 88. This is from Dave's Redistricting app, who I mentioned at the beginning here, which has this really neat feature. You can plot the race of the population as dots, and here the white population is represented by blue dots. The Black population is represented by green dots, the Asian population by red dots, and the Hispanic population by orange dots. Everybody else is brown. I'll let you take a moment and try to figure out where Green Bay Correctional Facility might be located in District 88. And just in case you haven't found it yet, there is a rectangle at the top left hand here of that district that is overwhelmingly Black. And in fact, that is where the facility is located. Obviously, as you can tell here too, it's not completely homogeneous, but overwhelmingly the remainder of the district, with the exception of a Hispanic population right here, is white. So again, if you want to see the data for all the districts, I encourage you to download the report for Wisconsin. You can also download the national report, which includes a detailed explainer on prison gerrymandering and provides that overview that we walked through earlier, along with some additional details. You can also go to our resource page on prison gerrymandering to download any of our reports in any of our other states, including, you know, that one I mentioned earlier in Louisiana. We also have some other articles, links to trainings, including some with Rory Kramer and Brianna Rempster talking about prison gerrymandering and the data that they collected. And of course, we also have our help desk, which is how we connected with you all in the first place. You can always send us questions at help@redistrictingdatahub.org. It's one of our favorite things to be able to help people sort of better understand redistricting, gerrymandering, and, you know, of course, work on reforms in their states and localities. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have or defer to Peter. And thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you, Kate. That was very interesting and complicated, but you can see where we're going here. I just put a question in the chat, and I do have a concern that with the prison gerrymandering that we're experiencing here in Wisconsin, there might be a real financial impact because the census drives kind of the dollars that come from the federal government to the state of Wisconsin. What would be the financial impact for those communities that would lose or gain, you know, substantial amount of population?
That's a great question, Deborah. I can't exactly quantify it, but it is very true that basically the census has two really big purposes. One is redistricting, which is our focus, but the other is that data ends up being used in a lot of federal formulas to determine federal spending across a whole variety of issues, you know, health, education, all sorts of services. You know, we're talking about probably trillions of dollars, certainly billions and billions of dollars that get spent every year by the federal government. And so they rely on that census data to figure out how many people, you know, should be eligible or might need services that they support financially in those communities. And so absolutely right. As long as incarcerated people are counted at these facilities and not at their communities, those dollars also go there as well to those districts with the facilities and not to the places and communities where they're from. It is possible that Prison Policy Initiative would have more details about that, about the exact financial impact that this might be having, because that's not something that we've specifically looked into, but it's certainly not trivial. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Please feel free, others, to put your questions in the chat. I do see a question here from Dorothy. Could the prohibition of racial gerrymandering be an effective argument in a lawsuit insisting that prisons facilitate voter registration and voting among incarcerated persons who are eligible to register and vote?
That's also a great question, Dorothy, and I wish I knew more. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm definitely gonna put a big old bag of salt on this answer and start with, like, I don't know is my honest answer to that question. And you know, frankly, what we've seen from the courts, if anything, is an erosion of the Voting Rights Act, right? Making it more and more difficult to, you know, ensure that protected minority groups have an opportunity to elect candidates of their choice when there is evidence that, you know, that there's racial discrimination that's been happening in that jurisdiction, and that minority group has been sort of systematically prevented from electing those candidates. So in the current climate, I personally would not be too optimistic that that argument would be well received. But I think from an evidence perspective, there certainly is, you know, some suggestion that it could have impacts there. Because, you know, basically what a lot of groups that are working on racial gerrymandering look at is they do what's called a racially polarized voting analysis. And without getting too much into the weeds here, in most states, you are using data from the census, either the 2020 census or some of their more updated data, you know, from the American Community Survey, and they're looking specifically at what's called the citizen voting age population, basically trying to narrow it down to the people who are eligible to vote in that community, and using that as part of the analysis to figure out if, you know, for example, in Wisconsin, if the Black community and the white community are sort of consistently supporting candidates in different parties. And, you know, again, as an example, if the Black community is sort of systematically being denied an opportunity to have a representative represent them in the legislature. So, you know, in my mind, the fact that the census data is impacted by this decision, you know, certainly suggests that it would have an impact on the results that you get in these racially polarized voting analyses. But, and again, big bag of salt here. I'm not a lawyer. You know, the court has been pretty skeptical towards a lot of those kinds of racial gerrymandering claims as of late. And there is a lot of concern that they are going to erode the Voting Rights Act even further. So I don't, I think in general, folks are more focused on just trying to keep the part of the Voting Rights Act that's still in effect hanging in there and not struck down.
Thank you. Dorothy has a follow-up question, wondering, in the states that have achieved reform, what were the effective public messages in getting it done?
Yeah, great questions all around. So this is, again, I think a question for the Prison Policy Initiative, but something that we have observed to successful campaigns more broadly is, number one, coalitions. You know, that it's very challenging for one individual or even just one group to actually affect change in a lot of cases. And it's really about bringing on as many partners as possible into the state, getting them educated about the issue, sort of working out any differences of opinion within that coalition so that they're providing a united front when they start talking to legislators about this issue. Something else that I have heard about this is, really taking a bipartisan approach. It's not always clear that one party is benefiting or losing as a result of prison gerrymandering. And so it really is an issue of fairness and not an issue of trying to advantage one particular party over another. And so, Prison Policy Initiative has mentioned, that they will talk to anybody who is, open to listening to this. But it is, especially for those really small districts where the prison ends up being a big part of the population and they're getting a lot of funding as a result of that. And then also, as I mentioned at the outset, the non-incarcerated population around that facility in that district ends up having a lot of voting power. Those are challenging folks to bring on board more likely than not. But yeah, I mean, the number one thing I would say is, if you haven't already, reach out to any other group in the state who, other redistricting groups, other criminal justice reform groups, anybody else who might be open to working with you all on this issue, and start building up the numbers. And then Prison Policy Initiative, again, will have, I think, a lot more resources. I'm gonna take a look and send some things to Deborah, next week, spend some time tracking some stuff down that I just don't have on me at the moment, where they might have also some pointers about specific kinds of messaging or language that could be useful to use in communicating about this with others.
Let's conclude then. Gail put a question in the chat that spoke to the solution of, how we count the incarcerated folks, and what would it look like and why is there resistance? Now, Peter, if you want to come off mute, I know you shared an answer in the chat, but maybe from both of you get some insight here.
Yeah, so as I had written there in the chat, I think it would require them asking for some more info as part of their outreach. So currently when they're outreaching to jails, they're asking for counts and information on race. So this would also require them asking for address information. So it would require some extra steps in there. And in terms of why they have not implemented it as of yet, I'm not exactly sure. Kate might be able to speak to this more, but it might add there might be some folks who want the file as it is now, and this would be kind of an alternative use. So it might require them to have more work or two files that they come out with, but that's kind of my understanding. Any thoughts, Kate?
Yeah, that touched on a lot of it, Peter. I actually got a chance to ask Dr. Santos, who's the current director of the Census Bureau, about this exact issue, which is why I could say with confidence that the Bureau seems pretty skeptical at this stage about making any changes. And from his perspective, the thing that struck me about his response was he said, once we start getting away from counting people at their residence, things gets complicated. And I think, or I wonder at least, how much he knows about the turnover in these prisons and jails, and just the fact that there are lots of people that are not there for 10 years. And in some cases, like only a month or two, or maybe even like a couple days, right? If you're talking about the jails. And so maybe, this is just a guess, with some greater education at the Census Bureau, they would be more open to that, because he was really using that sort of like principled concept of usual residence to say like, I think once we start moving away from that, things get really, really messy. But, again, as I noted, there are other messy situations that they already have to deal with. So, but, to Peter's point, it is another set of data that they would have to collect from every state. And if these states are telling the truth, some of them actually don't have the data on hand. So they would have to go out and, you know, create these data sets, these last known address data sets to hand over to the Census Bureau and to make this happen. So, you know, the census, the more I learn about it, it's already pretty complicated. So I'm like, personally a little skeptical about like, oh no, you know, like that's just like one too many things. It's like, you guys are already doing a lot to try to count everybody, you know, in the United States. But it just, yeah, it didn't seem like it was an issue high on his agenda. The last thing I'll say about that too is just that we did just sign on to a letter from the Prison Policy Initiative urging the Census Bureau. They do a lot of small scale testing, you know, throughout the decade. They're going to make some changes, for example, to how race and ethnicity is reported in the census data in 2030. So their Hispanic is no longer going to be separated out as a separate ethnicity. It's just going to be in a list with all the other races. And then also they're going to be reporting Middle Eastern and North African separately, which up till now, those folks have been counted as white. But if you ask most of those folks, they say, no, we are not white. So, you know, so they're doing all these changes and they do all this research to, you know, figure out basically what's the impact going to be on the data that they get back. And so the Prison Policy Initiative just sent them a letter urging them to do some small scale studies on the, you know, notion of sort of trying to obtain this data from states and to do this reallocation process in the 2030 census. We will see if they end up responding to that letter and they end up doing that. But that would be certainly a positive step in the right direction if they did decide to do that.
Wonderful, thank you. And Judy put a true league-like question in the chat that Peter has responded to, but she was wondering if eligible, you know, where a person would vote when incarcerated. And I think, Peter, you nailed it, that they would vote where they're incarcerated because that's their current address. As long as they were there 28 days in Wisconsin, that would be our residency rule. And then if they are released and go back to their community, then they would vote there. So thank you. Thank you both so very much for your contribution this morning. This is such a big issue here in Wisconsin. We know some counties are so benefited by this, you know, incarcerated population that's within their borders. And some counties, you know, and cities are really adversely impacted by pulling these populations into rural Wisconsin. So it's going to be a fight, obviously, and you know, the more information we have, I think the better we can be a part of it. So thank you.
Thank you. As I said, pleasure to be here and just really exciting to see so many folks on the call and, you know, taking their free time to work on important issues. It's one of the best things about the job, in my opinion, is getting to work with folks like you all and just, you know, remaining really optimistic about the future and the changes that we can implement.
Well, we invite you to stay and participate in what is the next section of this particular issues briefing. In Judge Mitchell's absence, what we thought we could do is share with our league members some important work that the state league and many local leagues are doing to ensure that we have an impartial judiciary, that we are working toward a nonpartisan redistricting process here in Wisconsin. Many local leagues have been invested in this work for years and years already. You know, Dane County did a very extensive jury selection study not long ago that was really, it brought out the importance of having a fair jury selection process, because then you get a more fair adjudication for individuals who are in the court system. We have in some communities across Wisconsin, leagues that are actually sponsoring court observer programs. There are court observer programs in many states around this nation, and this is to root out what are inequities in our sentencing practices. We have heard, you know, especially in the last number of years, about the inequities that we see in policing practices, but those same types of inequities are visible in our court system as well. And in order to achieve true justice in our judiciary in Wisconsin, I think there's a very real need to shine a light on, what is the scope of the problem with regard to inequitable sentencing, and how is that impacting communities and individuals in the state of Wisconsin. We also know at the state and in numerous local leagues throughout the Wisconsin that we have been working more assertively to stand up jail voting. And numerous projects around the state are in play. And what we've learned, of course, is and thanks to people like Karen Voss and league members who are dedicated to this work. But what we've learned is that though it might seem, a very appropriate thing for league to be involved in is trying to get our sheriffs on board that these individuals who have not been convicted of a felony still have their voting rights intact, that of course it's just logical to us as voting rights advocates that these individuals would indeed be allowed to the franchise. They would have their right to vote. But what we learn at the, where the rubber meets the road here in our jail system is there are many very real barriers for individuals who are incarcerated to access the ballot. And some of that just has to do with facility requirements about who can and who cannot use the internet. How could a ballot be delivered to a person who's incarcerated? How could they have a private vote essentially and maintain other constitutional protections? So it's not easy, but we are getting it done. That is the really good news, I think, that there are communities that are putting time and effort into ensuring that incarcerated people who are still eligible to vote have that right and have that access. And then I think we've been working with partners and on a number of higher level purposes, including helping to inform individuals who are leaving the prison system, have completed their supervision phase of their sentencing. They have their rights restored to vote, but it's oftentimes a best kept secret among our folks involved with the justice system. A couple years ago now, in collaboration with our friends in the disability community, we actually led an effort to train, I believe it's about 1,800 Department of Corrections workers to be more proactive in helping individuals who are coming off paper understand how to register to vote, understand how to that their right to vote has been reestablished, and to be more proactive. It seemed before the training, what we learned was that, individuals at the onset of their incarceration, it's mentioned to them that at the end of the day, after they've completed all of their sentencing, their rights would be restored. But unless you help that individual understand when that is and how to actually register, how to vote, where to vote, how to learn about the candidates, all the work that we do as an organization. Many persons who had been convicted of felonies but are now eligible to vote continue to not vote because they just don't recognize that their rights have been reestablished. And we'll continue this work and many other phases of work such as this. But at a high level, I wanted to let people understand that the League is not novice in this space. We have been working for judicial justice for years and years and years in many aspects of both our local league work and our state league work. And I applaud all of you for your many efforts. I want to take just a moment. Joan Schwartz is here, who is our current chairperson for our Impartial Justice and Nonpartisan Redistricting Committee. That committee actually has broken itself into two subgroups, two ad hoc committees, one focusing very specifically on impartial justice work, and one focusing more specifically on nonpartisan redistricting and how to accomplish what is our current goal of really establishing in the state of Wisconsin an independent commission to be responsible to draw our maps. As we know in our fight in the redistricting space, that our maps are currently drawn by partisans. The gerrymander that we saw starting in 2011, 2012 was a result of kind of the supermajority of power being able to ensure through gerrymandering that their power would be retained for many elections to come. And in fact, that's exactly what we saw. It was only very recently at the onset of this year where we were able to have the legislature and the governor actually work together to enact on February 19th the maps that we have now, which are the governor's maps. They're more fair maps. Are they the best maps? Well, as Kate mentioned at the onset of her talk, they're maps. They weren't necessarily drawn by special masters. They were drawn also by a partisan, but because they were better than what was, in place coming up to that negotiated compromise. We just came through an election cycle with those new maps. And really what we saw was kind of a surge in competitiveness. Districts that, the voters, the candidates knew that it was going to go one way because of the gerrymander. Now, all of a sudden, we're faced with a district that could be up for grabs. And many districts did, in fact, elect people who were not in the previous gerrymander, who would not have been the likely candidate to have been elected. And what we also saw from a league member's perspective, we saw more candidates. And that is a testament too, that, for people who sat on the sidelines because it wasn't worth the time or energy or money to run because they knew they couldn't win. Now, all of a sudden we're saying, hey, I have a shot. I'm a good person. I have a message to sell. I have people I want to represent. I could be a candidate in this particular race. And that is all good for the state of Wisconsin. Our next task now is to long-term take the partisan district mapping process away from the partisans and give it to the citizens. Ensure that we have an independent, citizen-led commission that will be able to draw our maps, that they ultimately will have the authority. So lots of changes are going to need to happen because our Constitution actually gives that authority to the legislature. So short term, we're going to need a process to establish an independent commission, but longer term, we'll need a constitutional amendment that will actually give the power of redistricting to an independent commission and take that power out of the hands of partisans. And we know all partisans gerrymander. In Wisconsin, our gerrymander, starting in the Walker administration, was a GOP gerrymander. Our friends to the south in Illinois, they've been living under a Democratic gerrymander. And the reason is, of course, because once you get the gerrymander, it's very difficult to get out from under the gerrymander. So we've made great progress, and now we need to finish the job and really work to establish an independent commission and then work to amend our Constitution to ensure that that commission has full authority to enact maps. The other part of what our committee is doing, what Joan's committee is doing, has everything to do with judicial independence, which is the topic of this particular issues briefing, but the justice topic on all three of our issues briefings. We have laid out a couple of priorities, and I'm just going to articulate them at a high level, but I'll open up to Joan to give a little bit more information. We recognize that in our judiciary, there needs to be judicial independence. That's how our judiciary was set up to work. Co-equal branches of government, two partisan branches of government, the legislature and the legislative and the executive. And then there's the judiciary that is supposed to have been the check and balance branch, the completely independent branch. Well, lots of things have happened since our founders created those fine principles, not the least of which is, in our last Supreme Court race, Wisconsin saw an influx of $51 million. We probably will see more in the spring. This has created, money has created, if not in reality, in perception, a sense of partisanship, a sense of non-independence of our justices. And one strong backstop to that would be to have our justices adhere to recusal rules. So in the event that a large contribution had come from a company or a corporation that is going to be, heard, a case heard by the court, that person who took that large contribution would be asked to recuse themselves for conflict of interest reasons. We have at every level of our court system in Wisconsin, that conflict of interest check and balance. The only court in Wisconsin that does not have that is our Supreme Court. And not for want of trying, the league has been trying to get recusal rules, but we have not been successful. And that is something that we would like to work on and that this committee has in its sights to really lift up as an important way to ensure judicial independence. We also want to ensure that more people in the state of Wisconsin have knowledge about the courts as a whole, what they do, how they do it. And we've been doing much education as an organization around the purpose of the courts. We have done webinars. We plan to do some more webinars. But we also need our voters to understand that there are checks and balances in the court system. We have a Wisconsin Judicial Review Commission. This is the commission that holds our judges accountable for the decisions that they make and their behaviors, and their ability to maintain an ethical standard. And but it's a well-kept secret, frankly, that we have this. And so it's important, I think, to ensure that more people understand what the commission does, how they do their work, what the result of their work is, and to have a confidence that our judicial system is being held accountable, that our judges are being held to task to ensure that they are independent in their in how they hear and decide cases in the state of Wisconsin. We'll also be continuing our campaign at the state level about educating all voters about the importance of the lower courts in ultimately creating the feeder system for what is our higher courts. You don't walk into the job of being a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice without having been a part of the justice system in some way, shape, or form. And so we have to look at the education system. We have to look at the lower court system. People need to feel empowered. Voters need to feel empowered to vote for justices at all levels, not just Supreme Court justices, because those are the judges that ultimately could become a Supreme Court justice, and that's an important role the league can play. We know in the spring elections, our nonpartisan elections, that these are lower turnout elections, and many people don't even vote the part of the ballot, which is for our circuit court judges, our appellate judges, and that maybe there's something that we can do to help voters feel like they can make good decisions about the judges that are on our ballots in April. And then this committee will also be turning its attention, of course, to the very important Supreme Court race that we will have in 2025 in April. And then I'll just remind all of you that we will have in the next 6 years, 6 Supreme Court races. So we will be talking a lot about, what is the role of the Supreme Court? How do they do their work? How do they decide cases? What is their philosophy? And I think with that, I will turn it over to Joan, and she can give you a little bit more information about some of the nuts and bolts of what we're working on in the ad hoc committee having to do with the independent judiciary. Oh, Joan, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. You gave quite an overview, so I'll just make a couple of comments. I just want to comment that the redistricting part of this committee is chaired by Carleen Betchen, with all of her experience with the FAIR maps. And it's a big task for the next 6 years in order to get this independent redistricting commission and ultimately to a constitutional amendment. So if you're at all interested, you can contact me about that, perhaps getting to be a part of the process. The impartial justice is, I chair both committees, the redistricting and the impartial justice, but I do run the impartial justice part of the committee. I am a retired attorney at this point, and so it's close to my heart to be working on this committee. We're the committee that literally put on all the webinars for the constitutional amendments. Marcy's Law, the private funding of elections, the government authority for federal grants to Wisconsin, and this last one with citizen voting, with the amendment changing just the wording from every to only, which confused a lot of people. We ended up with a no on the governing authority, staying with the authority for the federal government grants, staying with Governor Evers, and we ended up with a really high no vote on that. I wish we could say that about the other constitutional amendments, but we did provide a lot of information, as well as other groups did working with us. What we're focusing on now is the Supreme Court race that's coming up, and we're tentatively planning at this point 2 webinars. The first webinar will be focusing on what Deborah talked about, which is the recusal and the connection to campaign contributions. 2000, we were considered a really clean state. We were the golden standard basically throughout the United States, and we are no longer that, of course. And the webinar will go into the chronology of exactly how we got to where we are right now. A lot of people do not know that we once had an Impartial Justice Act, and it was really solid about campaign contributions and recusal, but it was repealed by Scott Walker, and things have been downhill since. We've had the league take many positions on recusal. At the Supreme Court, 52 retired judges put their suggestions into the court. That didn't work either. The standard we have today, if you want to call it a standard, is self-recusal. You get to choose if they want to stay in a case or not. So this is a really important issue that we need to focus on. We'll be having experts discussing these issues in depth at the first webinar. We plan to have that sometime in mid-January. The second webinar that we'll be doing in April will be really focusing on how we can figure out who these candidates are, how they judge, what they really think about judging, their method of judging. Sometimes it's just really superficial to ask a candidate, what's your philosophy of judging? And we don't get very specific answers. So we're going to work really hard on figuring out the kinds of approaches we can use to these candidates to get specific answers about their method of reading statutes, reading the Constitution, and understanding exactly what's going to happen. Because so often we know how a justice is going to rule prior before the even oral arguments are heard. And we need to have a real handle on that. So that's one of the things we're going to work on for the second webinar, which will be sometime in March. So that's the overview of the work that we're doing. As Deborah says, 6 years of Supreme Court elections ahead of us. We obviously need some real grounding that the League is able to provide in terms of how to handle these Supreme Court elections and get the public educated to what's needed for the candidates as they're running for these elections. And a lot of work on the campaign contributions that are totally out of line, the special interests. Not that we're going to solve it, but we certainly need to understand it, and we need to understand how the connection works with the recusal issue, as we said for the first webinar. So I'll take any questions. I do want to add that the committees are excellent committees, working really, really hard. Lots of brainstorming in our committee meetings, lots of research going on. Everybody steps up to the plate. So it's a great group of League members working throughout the state that are on both committees. So if you're at all interested in working on either one of them, we'd love to have you.
Thank you, Joan. I will mention that in the chat, Peter dropped a sentencing project report that might be of interest to folks. And then Eileen added some of the toolkits that the State League has put together, having to do with voting rights restoration and having to do with jail administrator voting in the jail setting. So, so more evidence that we're in the space, we're active, and we're advocating. So, okay, I'm reading and trying to ask at the same time. Kate put a question, and why don't you just come off mute, Kate, and go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, if that's me, no question. I was just making a pitch for to emphasize how great it is that you all are working to get a truly independent commission in Wisconsin. You know, I figure maybe I'm being a regionalist here, but if Michigan can do it, you all can do it. Common Cause, who's one of our stakeholders, does a lot of work on commissions specifically. They actually released a report just this fall, if you haven't already seen it yet. So I put a link in the chat to it, because there are a lot of states at this point that do have citizens commissions. And there is also, again, state to state, a ton of variation in how those commissions are put together, how the commissioners are selected, the rules and criteria that they adopt. So I think there's a lot of really handy lessons in there that hopefully will be helpful in informing your all's work.
And we're proud partners of Common Cause here in Wisconsin as well. And this work is being done by so many. You know, the Fair Maps Coalition started as a small group of, 8 organizations that were really trying to move toward, ending gerrymandering. And the Fair Maps Coalition now is 30+ member organizations, all sort of charging in the right direction to ensure that long-term Wisconsin gets a districting process that serves Wisconsin and creates a representative government that we may or may not have achieved without the continuous fair maps process being adopted here in Wisconsin. With that, I'll open it up, as Joan said, to questions. If you're curious about what we're planning or doing, if you have questions about or more information that you would like from Peter or Kate, now's your moment. I'm not seeing hands. So you can go ahead and just come off mute and ask questions. Gail, please.
Hi. Will the state be doing a Supreme Court candidate forum? Do you have any plans for that?
Well, interestingly, yesterday I was talking with some fine folks in the Milwaukee League, where you are from, Gail, that they would like to co-sponsor a forum, and we would like to co-sponsor with them. The issue is going to be, we can extend the invitation after the deadline for the submission of nomination papers. As we have seen in recent years, not all of our invitations are responded to affirmatively. So we'll hope for the best. We did have a forum a couple of years ago between Jill Karofsky and Dan Kelly. And I think that was a very successful forum. And we'll hope for the best, that these candidates will want to get in front of an audience of the folks who need to be informed on their positions and their thoughts so that they can vote.
Thank you.
Other questions? Well, Joan, I think we must have done a very good job in letting people know what we're up to. I will say, just as a trailing thought, that I think we all know how money has influenced not just our judicial races, but all of politics. The National League has a very strong money in politics opposition statement. And we will continue to advocate to get the money out of politics so that we see, like Joan was talking about, that gold standard in what is governance. There's a way to get back to not just the way Wisconsin was, but I think the way the nation was before we, empowered corporations to use money as voice. And, there's a lot of things that have happened that have kind of changed the landscape. And serious discussions will need to be had within our organization, with our partners, and with all voters about whether the impact of some of those money decisions have benefited or not benefited the citizens of this nation. So unless there's another question, I will give you a little time back today. Thank you all.